There is a moment, and every person who has ever worked a trauma bay knows this moment, when the noise stops mattering. Not because the room goes quiet. It never goes quiet. The monitors are screaming, someone is crying, a gurney wheel is squealing against linoleum, and 3 people are talking at once. The noise is total. The noise is everywhere. But there is a moment when one person in the room stops hearing it. When everything outside a 2-foot radius simply ceases to exist. When the hands take over from the mind, and the mind goes somewhere cold and clear and ancient, and the body does what it was built, trained, and broken into doing. You are about to watch that moment happen to a woman that everyone in that hospital had already written off. Stay with this until the end. Drop your location in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it started. Chapter 1. The slow one. Her name was Maren Voss. She was 58 years old, and she walked the halls of Crescent Ridge Memorial Hospital with a slight forward lean, like a woman perpetually heading into a headwind. Her hair was silver white and pulled back in a bun so tight it looked structural. Her scrubs were the same faded navy blue she'd worn for 3 years. Washed so many times the color had gone soft at the elbows and knees. She carried a pen in her breast pocket, a small notebook in her left cargo pocket, and nothing else. No phone clipped to her waistband. No personal items dangling from her badge lanyard. Just the pen, the notebook, and herself. She had worked the emergency department at Crescent Ridge for 3 years. Before that, there was a gap in her employment record that nobody had ever thought to question, because nobody had ever thought much about Maren Voss at all. She was quiet. She was methodical. She moved at a pace that her younger colleagues had taken to describing, in the break room and in the hallways and sometimes directly to her face, as glacial. "Maren, can you grab bed 6? That was how it usually started. Polite enough on the surface. "Already on it," she would say. "It's just, the patient's been waiting 20 minutes. I know how long they've been waiting." She always knew. That was the thing none of them had figured out yet. Maren Voss always knew exactly how long every patient in her section had been waiting, what their chief complaint was, what their last set of vitals looked like, and what the 3 most likely differentials were. She carried all of it in her head simultaneously, like a chess player holding 12 games at once. But she moved through the department at her own pace, and her pace looked slow, and in an emergency department where speed was the visible currency of competence, looking slow was a sin that no amount of accuracy could redeem. The charge nurse was a woman named Dana Fitch, 34 years old, 8 years in the ER, fast as a whip and twice as sharp, or so she believed. Dana had a way of standing in the middle of the department with her hands on her hips and her eyes scanning the floor like a general surveying a battlefield, and she had decided within 3 months of Maren's arrival that Maren was a liability. "She's going to get someone killed," Dana told the unit manager once, quietly, in the supply room. "She's too slow. She's too old. She doesn't move like someone who belongs in a trauma bay." The unit manager, a man named Gerald who had survived 17 years of hospital administration by never taking a hard position on anything, had nodded and said he would keep an eye on it. He never did. The attending physician who worked most often with Maren was a 39-year-old named Dr. Callum Reese. He was tall, good-looking in a way that he was fully aware of, and he had completed his emergency medicine residency at a program ranked in the top 5 in the country. He had a habit of calling Maren the nurse when speaking to residents, as in, "Ask the nurse to get me a 12 lead," even when Maren was standing directly in front of him. He never called the younger nurses the nurse. He called them by name. Maren noticed. She always noticed. She said nothing. There was a 3rd-year resident named Priya who had started 3 months ago and who had attached herself to Dana's orbit the way junior staff always attach themselves to whoever seems to hold the social power in a department. Priya was bright and earnest and had not yet developed the self-awareness to understand that dismissing a colleague based on their age and pace was a form of arrogance that the universe had a particular talent for correcting. One Tuesday morning, Priya had watched Maren spend 4 minutes at the bedside of a 71-year-old man with chest pain. Not doing anything that looked dramatic, just talking to him, touching his wrist, looking at his face, and then Maren had walked calmly to the nursing station and said, "Bed 4 needs a stat echo. His pain is pleuritic and he's got a friction rub. I think it's pericarditis, not ACS." Priya had started to say something dismissive. Dr. Reese had ordered the echo, more to move things along than because he believed Maren, and 40 minutes later the cardiologist confirmed acute pericarditis. Reese had looked at the result. He had not looked at Maren. He had moved on. That was how it went. The diagnoses she caught. The complications she flagged before they became emergencies. The families she steadied with 3 sentences when a less experienced person would have spent 20 minutes and still left them frightened. None of it accumulated into credit. It evaporated. Because she was slow. Because she was old. Because she didn't move like someone who belonged in a trauma bay. She had stopped trying to explain herself years before she ever set foot in Crescent Ridge. She had stopped needing to. But there were nights, and this matters because it is the thing that makes her human rather than mythological. There were nights when she sat in her car in the hospital parking garage after a long shift and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel and breathed. Just breathed. Not crying. Not angry. Just breathing through something that had no clean name. Something that lived in the space between dignity and exhaustion. And she would sit there until it passed, and then she would start the car and drive home. On her kitchen table, there was a photograph she never displayed anywhere else in the house. It showed a younger version of herself. Mid-30s, hair dark, wearing a flight suit, standing on the deck of something large and gray and metal. She was laughing at something off-camera. Her arm was around the shoulder of a man whose face she had not been able to look at directly in over 20 years. She kept the photograph face down most of the time. Chapter 2. The night before the shift that would change everything at Crescent Ridge started on a Thursday evening in late October. The weather had been building all day. One of those low-pressure systems that rolls in off the coast and turns the sky the color of a bruise by 3 in the afternoon. By the time Maren arrived for her 7 to 7 night shift, the rain was coming down sideways and the ER waiting room was already at 70% capacity. She clocked in. She got her assignment. She did her rounds. Dana was charged that night, which meant the particular low-grade friction that characterized their working relationship would be a constant background frequency for the next 12 hours. Dana had already reorganized the supply cart in Maren's section, a thing she did periodically without announcement, in a way that forced Maren to spend time locating items that had been in the same place for months. Maren noticed. She reorganized nothing. She simply memorized the new locations and moved on. Dr. Reese was the attending until midnight, when he would be relieved by Dr. Yolanda Marsh, the overnight attending. Priya was on with 2 other residents, a second-year named Tom who was competent and quiet, and a fourth-year named Garrett who was already mentally writing his fellowship application and treating the overnight shift as an obstacle between himself and his future. The first 4 hours were standard. Lacerations, a pediatric asthma exacerbation, 2 chest pains that turned out to be musculoskeletal, a woman with a migraine who had been to the ER 4 times in 2 months and who Maren treated with the same unhurried care she gave to everyone, which the woman noticed and which made her cry a little quietly into the pillow. At 11:14 p.m., the radio in the ambulance bay crackled. Maren was at the nursing station writing a note when she heard it. She stopped writing. She turned her head toward the sound. Around her, the department continued at its usual pace. Dana was on the phone. Priya was reviewing a chart. Tom was suturing a laceration in Bay 3. The radio crackled again, and this time the words came through clearly enough that 3 people in the department looked up at once. A charter bus had gone off Route 9 at the curve above Millhaven Creek. The road was wet. The bus had been carrying a high school choir returning from a regional competition. 41 passengers. The bus had rolled twice and come to rest against the guardrail with the front section partially submerged in the creek. First responders were on scene. They were calling in 14 critical patients. 14. To Crescent Ridge Memorial, which had 12 trauma bays, 2 of which were currently occupied. The department went very still for exactly 3 seconds. Then it went loud. Chapter 3. The fracture point. The call came through official channels 30 seconds after the radio transmission. The charge nurse was supposed to activate the mass casualty protocol. Dana was the charge nurse. Dana stood at the nursing station with the phone in her hand and her face doing something complicated. Not panic exactly, but the precursor to it, the moment before the architecture holds or gives way. "Okay," Dana said. Okay. We need to activate MCI. We need to call the house supervisor. We need Tom. Get out of that suture, we need all hands. Garrett, call the OR and tell them. Tell them what? Garrett said. Tell them we have 14 criticals incoming. I know that. What do I tell them to do? Dana stared at him. Tell them to be ready. Ready for what specifically? Do we know injury patterns? Do we know? I don't know yet, Garrett, just call them. Priya had her phone out and was reading something. The MCI protocol says we need to designate a triage officer, a treatment officer, and a transport officer. Who's the triage officer? I'll do it, Dana said. You're charge. I know I'm charge. You can't be charge and triage officer. I know that, Priya. The ambulance bay doors burst open and the first two paramedics came through at a run, and the gurney between them held a teenage girl with a cervical collar and blood sheeting down the left side of her face from a scalp laceration, and she was conscious and screaming, and the screaming broke something loose in the department because suddenly everyone was moving at once but nobody was moving in the same direction. Reese met the gurney. What do we have? 14-year-old female, restrained passenger, GCS 14, BP's holding at 110/70. She's got a left tib-fib fracture and that scalp black, but she's your most stable incoming. The rest? The paramedic shook his head. The rest are bad. We've got a driver who's got a steering wheel to the chest. We've got 3 kids with head injuries. We've got 2 who we're not sure about yet. Reese nodded. He turned to the department. He opened his mouth, and Maren Voss stepped forward. She had been standing at the edge of the nursing station, perfectly still, since the radio crackled. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She had simply stood there with her notebook open and her pen moving, and in the 45 seconds since the call came in, she had written 11 lines in a hand so small and precise it looked typeset. Dr. Reese, she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It had a quality that cut through ambient noise the way a tuning fork cuts through a crowded room, not by being louder than everything else, but by being a different frequency entirely. Reese turned to look at her. You need to call the OR now and request 3 teams on standby. You need to call vascular. There will be at least 2 aortic injuries in a rollover at that speed on that road. You need to designate this hallway as overflow triage because you're going to run out of bays in 11 minutes. You need someone on the radio with EMS to get injury patterns before the next wave hits so you're not surprised. And you need to send Dana to coordinate the floor beds because that's where she'll do the most good right now. The department had gone quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a slow night. The sharp, pressurized quiet of a room full of people who have just heard something that reordered their understanding of a situation. Reese stared at her. Maren? The triage officer should be me, she said. The treatment officer should be Priya. Tom stays mobile. You stay on the floor. That's the structure. A beat. 1 beat. Who put you in charge? Dana said. Her voice was flat, controlled, but there was something underneath it that was not quite anger, something closer to the feeling you get when the ground shifts under your feet. Maren looked at her. Nobody, she said. Go coordinate the floor beds, Dana. You're the best person for it, and we need it done in the next 4 minutes. It was not a power grab. It was not a performance. It was a woman who had done this before, had done this in conditions that made a wet road and a charter bus look like a controlled exercise, stepping into the only role that made sense given what was coming, and framing it in the only language that bypassed ego. You are needed, you are the best person, go. Dana went. Later, she would not be able to fully explain why. She would say she was overwhelmed. She would say it made sense. She would not say the thing that was actually true, which was that Maren's voice had carried an authority so complete and so unperformed that arguing with it had felt, in that moment, like arguing with gravity. Chapter 4. 14 patients. The second wave hit at 11:22. 3 ambulances, staggered by 90 seconds. 6 patients. The hallway outside the ambulance bay became a triage corridor in real time, and Maren stood at the center of it with her notebook and her pen in her hands, and she moved through those 6 patients in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. A time that Tom would later recount to colleagues with the specific precision of someone who had been watching a clock because they could not fully believe what they were seeing. She touched each patient. Not a cursory assessment, a real one. Hands on the chest, fingers at the throat, eyes reading the face. She spoke to each one. Not to comfort, though comfort was a byproduct. To gather data. She asked about pain location, about sensation in extremities, about the last thing they remembered before impact. She looked at skin color, at respiratory effort, at the way a hand moved or failed to move when she asked the patient to squeeze. She tagged them as she went. Green, green, red, red, yellow, black. The last one, the black tag, was a 17-year-old boy who had been found face down in the creek. The paramedics had worked him for 8 minutes in the field. He had no pulse, no respirations, and his pupils were fixed and dilated. He was hypothermic from the water. His pupils were fixed. Maren put her hand on his chest. She looked at his face. She was still for exactly 4 seconds, long enough that Tom, watching, thought she was going to change the tag. She didn't change the tag. She moved on. That is the hardest thing in mass casualty triage. Not the fast decisions. The fast decisions are almost easy, because the training takes over and the criteria are clear. The hardest thing is the still moment, the 4 seconds when you look at a face and you know that the correct decision is to walk away, and you make that decision anyway, and you carry it with you for the rest of your life and you make it anyway. Maren had made that decision before. More than once. In places that did not appear on her resume. The third wave came in at 11:31. 5 more patients, 2 of them critical. The department was at full capacity and beyond it. Gurneys in the hallway. Monitors alarming. A teenage girl in Bay 7 was deteriorating. Her blood pressure dropping. Her oxygen saturation falling. Her breath sounds unequal. Priya was at the bedside, and Priya was good. Priya was genuinely good. But she was looking at the vitals and looking at the patient and looking back at the vitals with the expression of someone who knows the answer is somewhere in what they're seeing but cannot yet pull it into focus. Maren appeared at the curtain. She looked at the patient for 2 seconds. Listened to the breath sounds with the stethoscope she had lifted from the supply cart, right side, then left. She pressed along the trachea with 2 fingers. Tension pneumo, she said. Trachea's deviating. She needs a needle now. Priya reached for the crash cart. I'll get Dr. Reese. No time. Maren was already pulling on gloves. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Get me a 14-gauge needle. You can't. Get me the needle, Priya. Priya got the needle. Maren performed the needle decompression with the economy of motion that comes from having done a procedure so many times that the body no longer needs to think about it. The rush of air was audible. The patient's oxygen saturation, which had been at 81% and falling, began to climb. 83, 87, 91. Priya was staring at Maren's hands. Chest tube next, Maren said. Can you place it? Yes, Priya said. And then, quietly, almost to herself, yes, I can do it. Good. I'll be in the hallway. Chapter 5. The thoracotomy at 11:47 p.m. A gurney came through the ambulance bay doors at a run, and the paramedic riding it was doing CPR with both hands and his entire body weight, and he was shouting before the doors were fully open. Male 42, the bus driver. Steering column to the chest. Lost his pulse in the field. We've been down for 6 minutes. BP was undetectable before arrest. He's got JVD, muffled heart sounds. Maren was already moving toward them. Beck's triad, she said. Cardiac tamponade. She looked at the paramedic. How long since the crash? Maybe 25 minutes. She looked at the patient. His face was gray-white and slack, the color of old concrete. His neck veins were distended. She could see them from 3 feet away. His chest had the particular stillness of a chest that is not moving air the way it should. She looked down the hallway. Every bay was full. Every physician was occupied. Reese was at the far end of the department managing a pediatric head injury. The OR teams were still assembling upstairs. There was no one coming. She looked at the patient. She said, "Get me a thoracotomy tray. Now." The paramedic looked at her. "You're a nurse. Get me the tray." Tom appeared at her elbow. He had heard the exchange and he was already moving toward the supply room. He did not ask questions. He had been watching Maren for the last 26 minutes and he had stopped asking questions. The thoracotomy tray arrived. Maren snapped on sterile gloves. She looked at the patient's chest at the left lateral aspect, and she made a decision in the time it takes to draw a breath. She made the incision. Later, when people tried to describe what they saw in that hallway, they kept using the word clean. The incision was clean. The technique was clean. The way she moved through the chest wall, through skin and subcutaneous tissue and the intercostal muscles, was clean in the way that a master woodworker's cut is clean, in the way that the work of someone who has done something 10,000 times is clean, which is to say it looked effortless even though it was not, it looked simple even though it was the furthest thing from simple, it looked like the most natural thing in the world even though it was a woman cutting open a man's chest in a hospital hallway with a department in chaos around her. She entered the pericardium, released the tamponade. Blood, dark, venous, accumulated, drained away from the heart sac, and the heart, freed from the pressure that had been strangling it, began to move. Not beating, not yet, but moving, fibrillating. Internal paddles, she said. Tom stared at her. Internal defibrillation paddles. They're on the crash cart. Get them. He got them. She defibrillated internally. Once, the heart converted. It was not a miracle. Miracles are random. This was the opposite of random. This was the product of training so deep it had become reflex, of knowledge so thoroughly integrated into muscle and mind that it operated below the level of conscious thought, of a woman who had opened chests before, in conditions that made a hospital hallway look like an operating theater, and who had done it because there was no one else to do it and because the alternative was watching someone die who did not have to. The bus driver's name was Raphael. He was 42 years old. He had a wife and 3 daughters. He had been driving charter buses for 11 years and had never had an accident. He had been on his way back from the best night of his professional life. His daughter's choir had won the regional competition, and she had been on the bus, and she was the 14-year-old girl with the scalp laceration who had come in first and who was currently in Bay 1 with a fracture and a headache and the specific terror of not knowing where her father was. Maren did not know any of this yet. She knew only that the heart in her hands was beating. She held it for 11 seconds, feeling the rhythm establish itself. Unsteady at first, then stronger, then steady, and then she stepped back and looked at Tom and said, "Get him to the OR, right now. They need to close this." Tom was already on the phone. Garrett appeared at the end of the hallway. He had been in Bay 9 managing a femur fracture and had heard the commotion. He walked toward the gurney and looked at the open chest and looked at Maren and looked at the open chest again. "Did you just," he said. "He needs the OR," Maren said. "Stop standing there." Garrett stepped aside. Chapter 6. The aftermath. By 1:15 a.m. The acute phase was over. Not resolved. Not clean. But contained. The department had absorbed 14 critical patients in the space of 90 minutes, and every one of them who had been savable was still alive. The boy with the black tag had not been savable. Raphael, the bus driver, was in the OR with a vascular team working on his aorta, and the cardiac surgeon who had received him had looked at the field thoracotomy and said nothing for a long moment before saying, very quietly, "Who did this?" The department looked like a storm had passed through it.
Gurnis at Odd Angels.
Supplies scattered. The floor in the hallway near Bay 11 had blood on it that nobody had gotten to yet. The monitors were still alarming in a dozen places, but the alarms had a different quality now, the quality of patients being monitored rather than patients being lost. Maren was at the nursing station. She was writing notes. She had been writing notes since the moment the acute phase ended, moving from patient to patient, documenting what had been done, what still needed to be done, what the next 12 hours would look like for each of the 13 surviving critical patients. Her handwriting was small and precise, and she wrote without pausing, without crossing anything out, as if the documentation were simply the next task in a sequence and she was moving through the sequence the way she moved through everything. Methodically, completely, without performance. Dana came back from the floor at 1:20. She stood at the entrance to the department and looked at what was there. The contained chaos, the living patients, the notes being written, and something crossed her face that she would not name until much later. She walked to the nursing station. She stood next to Maren. "The bus driver," she said. "Is he in the OR?" Maren said, without looking up from her notes. "They think he'll make it." Dana was quiet for a moment. "How did you know to do a thoracotomy?" Maren kept writing. Beck's triad. Tamponade after blunt chest trauma. Standard indication. That's not a standard nursing intervention. Maren said nothing. Maren. Dana's voice had changed. The edge was gone. What was underneath it was something rawer and less comfortable. Where did you learn to do that? Maren set down her pen. She looked at Dana. Her face was composed, not closed, not defensive, but composed in the way of someone who has decided to give a partial answer and is at peace with the partiality of it. A long time ago, she said. In a different life. She picked up her pen and went back to her notes. Dr. Reese found her at 2 a.m. He had been in 3 different bays since the acute phase ended, and he had the look of a man who has been moving very fast and has only just stopped and is now confronting what the stopping feels like. He stood across the nursing station from her. He looked at her for a long moment. The thoracotomy, he said. She waited. The paramedic said you made the call in under 30 seconds. The presentation was clear. The technique, he stopped. The cardiac surgeon said the technique was textbook. Better than textbook. He said it looked like someone who had done it in the field. Maren met his eyes. She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took for him to understand that she was not going to explain herself to him. Then she looked back at her notes. Reese stood there for another moment. Then he walked away. But he didn't let it go. That was the thing about Callum Reese. Underneath the arrogance, underneath the casual dismissiveness, there was a physician who was genuinely good at his job, and a genuinely good physician cannot see something that doesn't fit and simply decide not to look at it. It would bother him. It would bother him all night and into the next day and the day after that, and eventually it would bother him enough to do something about it. He pulled her file the following morning. Chapter 7. The file, the Human Resources file for Maren Voss, was 43 pages long. Most of it was standard. License verification, annual competency checks, performance reviews, all of which rated her as meets expectations in every category. A rating that, given what had happened the night before, Reese now understood to be a document of institutional blindness so complete it was almost impressive. Her employment history before Crescent Ridge was listed as follows. 3 years at a community hospital in coastal Maine, preceded by a 2-year gap listed as personal leave, preceded by 4 years at a VA hospital in Virginia, preceded by a gap of 18 months listed as transition period, preceded by 2 pages were blacked out, not redacted in the bureaucratic sense, where you can sometimes read the shape of the words through the ink. Fully blacked out. Both pages, top to bottom, margin to margin. Whoever had done it had been thorough. Below the blacked-out pages, the employment history resumed with a line that read, Prior service, United States Navy, dates and position classified per request of employee. Reese stared at the page for a long time. He called the HR director. The HR director said she had processed the file exactly as she had received it from the previous employer and that the redactions had been present when the file arrived. She had no information about what they contained. He called the VA hospital in Virginia. After 20 minutes on hold, he reached a records clerk who told him that Maren Voss had worked in their emergency department for 4 years and had been an excellent employee who had resigned without explanation and had declined an exit interview. He called the community hospital in Maine. The charge nurse who answered remembered Maren. Quiet, she said, kept to herself. Brilliant with patience. We were sorry to lose her. When Reese asked why Maren had left, the charge nurse said she didn't know. She just stopped coming in one day, left a letter. Very formal, very polite. Reese sat in his office with the file open in front of him and the 2 black pages staring back at him, and he thought about the thoracotomy in the hallway, and he thought about the way Maren had moved through 14 critical patients in the dark of a chaotic department with the calm of someone who had done it before, and he thought about the cardiac surgeon's words. It looked like someone who had done it in the field, and he began to understand that the woman he had been calling the nurse for 3 years was something he did not have a category for. He made one more call. A friend from residency who had done a military fellowship. He described what he had seen. He described the redacted pages. His friend was quiet for a moment. Field thoracotomy in a hallway, he said. Beck's triad recognition in under 30 seconds. Triage of 14 patients in under 5 minutes. Another pause. You said she's 58? Yes. And she's working as a floor nurse in a community ER. Yes. Callum, his friend said slowly. The only people I know who can do a field thoracotomy like that are trauma surgeons. And the only trauma surgeons who end up working as nurses in community hospitals with 2 pages blacked out of their file are people who walked away from something. Something significant. Reese looked at the black pages. Why would a trauma surgeon walk away? His friend said nothing for a moment. The ones I've known who did it, it was always the same reason. They lost someone they couldn't afford to lose. And they decided they couldn't risk losing anyone else the same way. Reese closed the file. He sat in his office for a long time after that, in the particular silence of a man who was reckoning with the distance between what he assumed and what was true. Chapter 8. What she carried. There are things that Maren Voss had not told anyone at Crescent Ridge, and most of them she would never tell anyone anywhere, and this is not because she was secretive by nature but because some things, once they have been lived, resist the reduction of language. She had been a trauma surgeon. Not just a trauma surgeon, a Navy trauma surgeon, which is a different thing, which means she had operated in conditions that most surgeons encounter only in their worst hypothetical scenarios. She had been deployed twice. She had worked in a forward surgical unit during a period of conflict that the 2 blacked-out pages referenced and that she had agreed, as a condition of her separation from service, not to discuss in detail. She had been very good. Not competent good. Not skilled good. The kind of good that gets noticed at the highest levels, that generates commendations and recommendations and quiet conversations among people with stars on their shoulders. The kind of good that, in a different life, might have led to a department chair or a named fellowship or a career that people wrote about. She had walked away at 37. The patient she lost, the one her friend's friend had intuited without knowing, was a man named Jonas. He was not just a patient. He had been her colleague first, then her closest friend, then something that the Navy's regulations at the time had made complicated in ways that neither of them had fully resolved before the day he came through the doors of her surgical unit with a chest wound that should have been survivable. She had operated on him herself. She had not recused herself, which she should have done, which she knew she should have done, which she would spend the next 20 years understanding in the way you understand the things that cannot be undone. She had operated on him because there was no one else available and because she was the best and because she could not stand the idea of anyone else's hands inside his chest. He had died on the table. Not from the chest wound. From a secondary injury. A hepatic laceration that had been missed in the initial assessment, that had been bleeding slowly and then catastrophically during the 90 minutes she had spent saving his heart. She had found it too late. She had stood in that surgical unit with her hands inside a man who was no longer there, and she had understood, with a clarity that felt like a physical impact, that her love for him had made her worse at her job. That the thing she had been most certain of, her own competence, her own steadiness, her own ability to perform under any pressure, had failed her at the exact moment it mattered most. She had submitted her separation papers 3 weeks later. She had spent a year in coastal Maine, in a rented house near the water, doing very little. She had gone back to nursing, not because she needed the credential, she already had it, she had maintained it throughout her surgical career as a kind of professional belt and suspenders, but because nursing put her close to patients without putting her in the position of the person who made the final call. It was a way of being useful without being responsible for outcomes in the way that had broken her. It had worked, mostly. For 20 years it had mostly worked. Except for the nights in the parking garage with her forehead against the steering wheel. Except for the photograph face down on the kitchen table. Except for the moments, rare but real, when a patient's presentation was so clear and the correct action so obvious and the person who should have been taking that action so absent that her hands had simply done what her hands knew how to do, and she had stepped back afterward and felt something that was not quite guilt and not quite pride and not quite grief but contained elements of all three. The thoracotomy in the hallway had been one of those moments. She had known, when she made the incision, that it would not go unnoticed. She had made it anyway, because Raphael was dying and there was no one else and her hands knew what to do. She had made peace with the consequences before the scalpel touched skin. Chapter 9. The reckoning. Reese found her in the break room at 7:15 a.m., at the end of her shift. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and her notebook, and she looked up when he came in but did not change her expression. He sat down across from her. He put the file on the table between them. He did not open it. He just put it there. She looked at it. She looked at him. The redacted pages. he said. Yes. You were a surgeon. She was quiet for a moment. I was. Navy. Yes. Trauma. Yes. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling, then at her. His face had gone through several iterations in the last few seconds. Surprise, then something like embarrassment, then something more complicated that she recognized as the specific discomfort of a person confronting the gap between their assumptions and reality. Why are you working as a nurse? He said. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked with something approaching humility. Because I wanted to, she said. That's not, he stopped. That's not a complete answer. No, she agreed. It's not. He was quiet for a moment. The thoracotomy, the cardiac surgeon said, he said whoever did it had done it before. Many times. In difficult conditions. He's right. You could have told us. When you started here. You could have. What would you have done differently? She said. Her voice was level. Not challenging. Genuinely curious. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Because the honest answer, the answer that a man of integrity had to arrive at eventually, was that he would have treated her the same way he treated any nurse with an impressive background, with the particular condescension of someone who has decided that a credential from a different domain does not translate. He would have been impressed, briefly, and then he would have found reasons to qualify it, and the qualifications would have calcified into dismissal, and the dismissal would have looked exactly like what had been happening for 3 years. I don't know, he said finally. Neither do I, she said. But I know what did happen. And I know what happened last night. He nodded slowly. He looked at the file. He looked at her. The residents are going to hear about this. The whole department is going to hear about it. They already have. Is that all right with you? She considered the question. It's fine, she said. It changes nothing. He frowned slightly. It changes everything. For you, maybe. She picked up her coffee. For me, I'm the same person I was yesterday. I'll come in Thursday, same shift, same section. I'll move at my own pace. I'll catch what I catch. That doesn't change. He stared at her. You're not going to, we should talk about your role here. Your actual role. Given what you... My role is fine, she said. Maren? Callum. She said his name for the first time. Not Dr. Reese. His name. It landed differently than he expected. I left surgery for a reason. I'm not going back. Not to the title, not to the responsibility. I'm a nurse. I'm a good nurse. Last night, I was also a person who happened to be in the right place with the right training and someone needed what I had. That's the whole story. He was quiet for a long time. The bus driver, he said finally.
Rafael.
His daughter was the first patient in. She looked up. She's been asking about her father. She doesn't know he was in arrest. She doesn't know what happened in the hallway. He paused. She knows someone helped him. The paramedics told her someone helped him. Maren set down her coffee. She was still for a moment. Then she nodded once and stood up. She walked down the hallway toward Bay 1. Chapter 10. What remains? The girl's name was Celia. She was 14 years old and she had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and she had been lying in Bay 1 for 8 hours with a headache and a wrapped ankle and a fear so large it had gone quiet inside her. The way very large things sometimes do. Maren pulled the curtain back and stepped in. Celia looked at her. At the silver-white hair and the faded navy scrubs and the face that was 58 years old and had seen things that faces that age sometimes carry without advertising. Are you the one? Celia said. Maren pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. Your father is in surgery, she said. He's going to need some time to recover, but they think he's going to be all right. Celia's face did something complicated. The fear that had gone quiet came back, briefly, in a wave that moved across her features and then receded. Her eyes filled. She did not let them overflow. He was scared, she said. Before the crash. He told me he was nervous driving in the rain. He always tells me stuff like that. He thinks it makes me feel better if he's honest about being scared. Does it? Yeah, she said. Kind of. She looked at Maren. Were you scared last night? Maren thought about the question. She thought about the hallway and the chest and the heart that had been still and then wasn't. She thought about Jonas 20 years ago, and the hepatic laceration she had found too late. She thought about the 4 seconds she had stood over the boy with the black tag and made the decision to walk away. Yes, she said. I was scared. Celia nodded, as if this confirmed something. But you did it anyway. That's what scared means, Maren said. It means you do it anyway. They sat together for a while after that. The department moved around them. Gurneys in the hallway, monitors alarming, the particular percussion of an ER at 7:30 in the morning. Shifting from night crew to day crew, the handoffs happening in doorways and at nursing stations and in the break room where a file sat on a table with 2 pages blacked out. Maren did not explain herself to the girl. She did not tell her about the Navy or the surgical unit or the man named Jonas or the photograph face down on the kitchen table. She did not tell her about 20 years of being the slow one, the old one, the soft one, the nurse who moved at her own pace through departments that had already decided she was not quite enough. She sat with Celia until the girl's mother arrived, breathless and tearful and clutching her daughter's hand. And then Maren stood up and stepped out of the bay and pulled the curtain closed behind her. Dana was in the hallway. She had been there for a minute or two, watching through the gap in the curtain. When Maren turned, she was standing there with her hands at her sides and her face doing the thing it had been doing since 1 a.m. The thing that did not have a clean name, the thing that lived in the space between what she had assumed and what she now knew. I said some things, Dana said, about you, over the years. Maren waited. I was wrong. It was 3 words. No qualification, no context, no self-exculpation. Just the 3 words, said in the voice of someone who has decided that the minimum viable honesty is the only kind worth offering. Maren looked at her for a moment. I know, she said.
I'm sorry.
I know that too.
Dana nodded.
She looked like she wanted to say more and had decided, correctly, that more was not what the moment needed. Maren walked past her toward the locker room. She changed out of her scrubs. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag and her keys and she walked through the department one more time. Past the bays that were filling again with the morning's patients, past the nursing station where Priya was doing handoff with the day nurse, past the spot in the hallway where the blood had been cleaned from the floor and you would not know, looking at it now, what had happened there 12 hours ago. Priya saw her passing and stopped mid-sentence. She looked at Maren with an expression that Maren recognized. It was the expression of someone who has watched something happen that has permanently reorganized their understanding of what a person can be, and who does not yet have the language for what they want to say. Maren nodded at her. Priya nodded back. That was enough. She walked through the ambulance bay doors and into the morning. The rain had stopped sometime in the night and the air was cold and clean, the kind of cold that makes the world look freshly made. The parking garage was half empty at this hour. Her car was where she had left it on the 2nd level in the spot she always used. She sat in the driver's seat. She did not press her forehead against the steering wheel. She sat upright with her hands in her lap, and she looked through the windshield at the gray concrete of the garage wall, and she breathed. Just breathed. She thought about Raphael's heart, beating in her hands. She thought about Celia's face. She thought about the boy with the black tag, and she let herself think about him for exactly as long as it took to feel the weight of him and then set it down. Not forget it. Set it down. There was a difference, and she had spent 20 years learning it. She thought about Jonas. She thought about the photograph. She thought about the flight suit and the gray metal deck and the laugh that had been caught by someone's camera on a day when she had not known that everything was about to become before and after. She thought, I did what I could do. Last night I did what I could do. It was not absolution. It was not redemption. It was not the clean narrative arc of a person who suffered and then healed and then triumphed. It was simpler than that and harder than that. It was a woman who had been broken by something real, who had rebuilt herself in a smaller shape, who had lived inside that smaller shape for 20 years, and who had discovered, in a hallway in the dark with a man's chest open in her hands, that the shape she had built was not as small as she had thought. She started the car. She drove home. On the kitchen table, the photograph was still face down. She walked past it the way she always did. She put the kettle on. She sat at the table and opened her notebook to a fresh page. She wrote one line. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed. We do not know what the line said. That is hers. that belongs to her in the way that the things we carry in the deepest part of ourselves belong to us. Not for sharing, not for display, not for the consumption of people who want the story to have a clean ending. What we know is this. The following Thursday, Maren Voss returned to Crescent Ridge Memorial Hospital for her 7 to 7 night shift. She clocked in. She got her assignment. She did her rounds. She moved at her own pace. And nobody said a word about it. If this story stayed with you, if Maren stayed with you, drop a like and leave your location in the comments. I want to see how far she travels. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, because there are more quiet people doing extraordinary things in ordinary hallways, carrying more than anyone around them knows. Those are the stories worth telling. See you in the next one.